in Matthew chapter 5. We're probably going to be looking at some things that we have reviewed and talked about before. What is the definition of reconcile? Reconcile. What do you do? How long has it been since any of you have reconciled your checkbook? Don't answer that. What is the definition of reconciliation? Make it right. Glenn was an auditor for how many years? Long time. What did you do when you went in to audit the books? He worked for Oklahoma State and you worked for OU too, correct? Reconciliate, that's an easy answer, wasn't it? He reconciled the books. He wanted to make sure that the balance sheet was what they said it was. If you're looking at one set of numbers compared to another set of numbers, you have to go through a lot of stuff. It's not an easy situation to go in and line item dollar by dollar and reconcile, is it? It's a long process sometimes, depending on how large the situation, how large the company is, and what the bottom line is, and how many $1 million you're working with. But reconciliation is a term that we've been using for years and years and years. We're going to start out in Matthew chapter 5, and I'm going to highlight some things this morning, and we're going to, I don't know how quick we'll move through this. But anyway, Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountains, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. He opened his mouth and began to teach them, saying, how many of you have seen The Chosen? Do you remember the scene where he's walking along with his disciples, and they're telling him, they're just visiting about some things, and then the people start showing up to listen to him, and they're there for the sole purpose, maybe of not being fed, but just to hear what Jesus has to say, because the people are starting to believe that he is truly the Messiah, which the Messiah is what? The Savior of the world, the Son of Jesus, Jesus the Christ. They are starting to understand a little bit about his possibility. It's possible. And not only that, some of them were thinking he's going to save our nation. He's going to bring the Jewish nation back to its proper place and if we hang around him long enough, maybe we will have a spot somewhere, not in his cabinet, but somewhere along the line we can have some authority. And so some of them probably showed up for that reason, but if you look at the scene in Chosen, he starts out and people start coming in a few at a time, and then there's literally thousands show up. And I don't know how the sound system was then, but everybody was able to hear him. But he starts speaking, and Kevin preached this, and so I'm just going to highlight it. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. I just want to highlight that we used to look at that passage, and we would share this passage with people who had lost a loved one. I don't believe that that's a possibility, that if you've lost Jesus is going to comfort you. But this probably is talking about blessed are those who mourn. He's talking about more spiritual things than he is physical things in this particular passage. Probably what he's talking about, if you confess your sins to God, and you mourn about the way you've lived and the person that you are, you will be comforted because, 1 Timothy says to confess your faults one to another. And that's probably what that passage is talking about, that we mourn the life that we live, we mourn the way we live, we mourn the way we've treated people, and therefore we will be comforted from Jesus. Verse 5, blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who, when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me, rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. He sets the whole scene up, and he tells them that happy you will be because of these things, blessed you will be because of these things. And then he says, in a way, if you're being persecuted because of me, you're going to be blessed. And you ought to be happy about that. You're going to be persecuted for a lot of different reasons. You can be at odds with different people over different situations. But if it's because of following me, in the long run, it's going to be worth it. We don't see persecution today the way some foreign countries. There's a book called Jesus Freaks. It was out years ago. If I remember correctly, it cites like 300 different cases of people in foreign countries who have been put to death. And it talks about how they were put to death and why they were put to death. And the main reason, the whole theme of the book, is these people would not deny that Jesus was the Son of God. They would not deny that God existed, and therefore they were put to death. And some of the ways they died were excruciating pain. And if you can ever get a copy of it, it's worth the read. It's a long book, but it's worth the read, and it's called Jesus Freaks. We're not persecuted like that today. Now, someday we may be, and the way things are going in our country right now, it is extremely unpopular to love Jesus. So someday we may know persecution, maybe not at the level they did, but someday we may know persecution. In verse 4 and 13, you are the salt of the earth. If the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown and trampled underfoot by men. Are you the salt of the earth? Are you when you're tested, do people see Jesus in you? Is it when you are pushed to the limit, do people see Jesus in you? Or do they see your personality? Or have you died to self to let Jesus rule your life and let his personality rule your life? In verse 14, he says, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Are you the light of the world? Do people look at you in an everyday life, and I'm talking about just the way you live, the way you are when you're out in public, and do people say, that must be a follower of Christ? There's something about that person that shines. There's something different Did you see the way they reacted when that clerk was very rude to them? Do you see the way they? Are you the salt of the earth? Do you let your light shine? Or when it comes time to talk about Jesus or talk about living for God or living a righteous life, metaphorically, do you have a tendency to snuff your candle out? Well, I don't want anybody to know that I'm a Christian. They might make fun of me. I don't want to put up with the ridicule. I don't want to go through that. I don't want to experience. I love Jesus, but I don't want anybody else to know it because of what I might have to go through. Do we live Jesus daily? And that's what Jesus is. He's telling this group. Eventually, he's going to tell them, if you're going to follow me, you're going to have to deny yourself and take up your cross daily and follow me. But he's building steps for them to get there. He's letting them know little by little, this is what's going to happen. And eventually then he tells them, if you're going to follow me, you must deny yourself daily and take up your cross and follow me. And then in verse 17, do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For I truly say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter of the stroke shall pass the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And this thing about how many of the 10 Commandments are we still under? How many? None. Why do you say none? 9? Does anybody agree it's none? We're not under any of the 10 Commandments. Gloria said Jesus repeated them. The principle is there, but the commandments that he says in this passage, it's bad if you try to do away with any of these until all is accomplished. What was he talking about? What had to be accomplished? His death, and not only his death, but his resurrection. When he was resurrected and proved that Satan had no control over death, same way with us today, spiritually, Satan has no control over our death. When we die, we're going to be dead, but spiritually we will be more alive than we've ever been before because Satan has no control. And because of that, it's what Jesus did at his resurrection. And he's saying until all is accomplished, and once that was accomplished, and then Acts 2, we know the new church, new things came into being. And he talks about some of this later in Matthew, and I don't know if we'll get there today or not. And if I'm not teaching anymore, we may never get there. But he said that everything that some of those 10 commandments were rewritten under a different. You've heard it said what? Do not murder. But I tell you what. If you hate your brother, it's like murder. I tell you, do not commit adultery, but if you look at a woman with lust, it's what? It's the same as committing it. They were done away with, but he re-emphasized them in a different way. Deanie? All right, Deanie said they're all still there, but they're worded different. All right, and that's a good point, but what part of the 10 Commandments, what other part of the old law, And depending on who you read, what part of the other 660 some odd laws that the Pharisees finally wound up writing, how many of those will we still follow? Okay, we don't, and we're going to talk about offering sacrifices this morning. That's where we're eventually going to get to. Jesus is our lawmaker, not Moses. And the principle is there. There's no love God. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Honor your father and mother. That's all there. But it's stated, and Deanie, it's stated in a different way. But the principle is still there, but it's more from the heart now than it was a physical reaction to things. Under the old law, it was a physical reaction. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit. Verse 21. Yeah. Okay, and Deanie said he made them stiffer, and that's probably a good way of looking at that, because he said, you've heard it, don't murder. Well, you could hate somebody, but as long as you didn't kill them, you were okay. But now, you can't have hate in your heart. And we're going to look at that. Verse 21, you have heard the ancients were told you shall not commit murder. And whoever commits murder, I guess we will get there. But I say to everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says to you, fool, you shall be guilty of fiery hell. What's the court system he's talking? You shall be guilty. Whoever says to his, but I say, verse 22, I say, everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. What's the court? Who was the court that he was talking about? Norman said God's court. Bible scholars think, and most of them agree on this, that he would have been referring, there was a situation set up if you disobeyed the law, and it was on a lesser level. The court you appeared before would have been the Sanhedrin court, and normally it was made up of 7 individuals. But then he says that if you're angry with your brother, you go before the court, but whoever says to his brother, you're good for nothing. If some of your translations use good for nothing, or some of them say raka. Any of them say raka? What translation? Is that New American Standard? Huh? Fool, you fool. I've heard another way of, in other words, you good for nothing. I heard some people say what they're saying is that you're a waste of skin. Well, that's pretty harsh. In other words, God totally made a mistake when he made you. That's pretty stout. But another way of putting that is that your soul is worthless. I don't care if you go to hell. I just don't care. I don't like you. I unlike you. I hate you. And as far as I'm concerned, you can burn in hell for eternity. And Norman said that if you feel that way, you will burn with that person. Bob? Well, don't say it then. Mm-hmm.
There's a whole group that says, I hate the homeless. I don't want to have anything to do with it. That group of people taking it to the next level. We have already read from the homeless bill we are preparing. Who would think in America that people hate homeless so bad that they don't want to have anything to do with anyone that wants to help them, and they want to do them? That is the word. You're going to have to stand up for those types of hatred because they're more subtle. They're not real out in the open. They're kind of under the surface.
Bob, to repeat for those who might be listening, Bob said there's an underlying current of people who, it's popular, let me paraphrase, it's popular to hate Jews in some places now. They are working on a homeless project. They have a building now, and they're trying to renovate that building, and there's a lot of things they're doing for the homeless as far as re-educating, trying to get them back into society. But they're getting a lot of threats from, I assume, the community of Hera, that people there don't want the homeless in their neighborhood. And so therefore they're getting threats against that. And that's similar to what Jesus is talking about. I'm worth something, but you're worth nothing. And we need to be very careful. The court here that he's talking about, some people, commentaries say, the court was made up of 7 Sanhedrin, but he says if you're worthless, you're good for nothing, or you're a total waste of skin, or your soul is worth nothing, I don't care if you go to hell, then you go before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in that situation would have been another group of Sanhedrin made up of 71 individuals. So it was a lot more dignified court, a lot more serious situation that you would appear before. And they understood what he was talking about. But then he says, whoever says to your brother, you good for nothing, you shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever says, you fool, you shall be guilty enough to go into fiery hell. Have you ever been called a fool? Have you ever been told that was a foolish thing to do? Have you ever been told you were stupid? What's he talking about in this passage? You fool. What is he? It's a situation evidently that is even worse than saying you're worthless. It goes to the level, I think it goes to the level of that your soul is not worth saving. I hate you enough that I don't care about you. And then he sets this thing up and he gives them some information they would have understood about the court, about the Supreme Court, and the seriousness of all that. And there he's talking to Jewish people and Jewish brothers and Jewish sisters, or men and women. So they would have understood in the tribes, if you hate each other, that's not good. And there were situations where if you got into a squabble, you'd either go to the court or you'd go to the Supreme Court, and you'd work all that out. But he's telling them now, if you're going to be a follower of me, there's a different system you come under. And what he says then in verse 23, therefore, if you're presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering, therefore, there before the altar, and go, first be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. What does that look like?
Well, that means that you still hate your brother. You're trying to offer a gift. God is not going to accept your gift.
Okay, Norman says that if you still hate you're trying to offer your gift, and you still hate your brother, God's not going to accept that gift. He's going to reject it. Sadie? The one okay, now Matthew 18 talks about if you have aught against your brother, you go to them. Is that what, are you referring? Okay, in my mind, that's a little bit of a different situation. In this situation, and if my understanding is correct, if you go to give your gift at the altar and you remember that you have something, your brother has something, you have something against your brother. If you're at odds with a brother, I used to believe that meant you went and apologized to him. I don't believe that anymore. Since we're not under the old law anymore and we no longer do sacrifices, this passage does not apply to us at all. You can treat anybody however you want to, and it's just fine. Huh? You're disagreeing with me? How dare you?
My interpretation of it is, well, for example, if I'm mad at you, you might not know this, but I still need to go to you and you will have the opportunity to explain to the
I'm sorry.
and I saw you and those gotta be upset with them.
I'll go the other way from now.
You know, having a conversation a lot of times clears it up. And if I'm mad at you and you don't know that I am, I'm still going to be eating something.
And you're the one that's given the You're the one that's given the offering.
Right.
Okay. What would have been the situation where, if you go to give your gift at the altar, what would have been the situation that would have taken place? How often did they do that? We know at least once a year, Aaron took 2 goats, and this is from Leviticus. Aaron would take 2 goats. He would sacrifice one, but then he would do what? Put his hands on the head of the goat, send it into the wilderness, and it would send the sins of Israel out into the wilderness for another year. The scapegoat. That would not have been what he was talking about here, because Aaron did that. There would have been individual sacrifices, and I couldn't find anywhere about how often that. It was pretty often, but nobody could nail down a number when that would happen. Deanie?
Here is the word brother. Is that a brother who's serving God right alongside you?
Deanie asked the question, the word brother, is that anyone, or is that anyone that you're just around, or is that someone that you serve God with? Who is that in that situation, the brother? Who is he talking to in context? Who's he talking to? He's talking to Jews, and my assumption would be that he's talking to Jewish people. He's talking to Jewish people who would understand. The Gentile people would not have understood. They sacrificed, but not to God. My understanding would be that he's talking to men and women of the Jewish faith in this context. But we talked about everything has changed when we went to Christianity. So if a person goes to give their gift at the altar, and they remember that somebody has something against them, go and reconcile. What is that? How do you do that? I used to think that meant you go and apologize. And I still think that has something to do with it, but we were discussing this the other night in Bible study. And somebody made the comment, that says reconcile. It doesn't say apologize. And I thought, that's right. To me, it would begin with an apology, but reconcile, if you look at the pure term of reconcile, you balance the books. Bob? All right.
But my offering, if I was taking my offering down there, and I hated Andy, I walked right by Andy. It's so important, excuse me, for us to be right with our brother, whether it's a brother in Christ or really anyone. How can you be right with God if you're not right with Andy and I, we really need to get together and work it out. God's probably not going to accept it, even though
Probably not, or won't. So how does that apply to you? You're not sacrificing. You're not taking a lamb to the priest. You're not giving a gift. You're not giving 2 turtle doves. How does that apply to us today then? Where is the correlation? How does that affect us, Carl? Okay. All right, Carl says that communion would be an example of that. If we're not right with a brother before we take communion, we need to go make it right with that brother. Is that, I've heard, I've never seen it, I've read, and I haven't even heard, I've read of different places that once in a while somebody will stand up, and normally it's a shepherd will stand up and read this passage before communion. And then he will say, if you have aught, or you remember that a brother has something against you, you've done something to a brother for some reason, before you take communion this morning, we're going to spend some time in silent prayer. If people would bow their heads and close their eyes, but if there's somebody in this assembly this morning that you need to make things right with before you take communion, you have opportunity to do that right now. And from what I have read, not from the people in the pew, but the shepherd said that you would see people get up from like that side of the auditorium and walk over to that side of the auditorium. He didn't know what was said, but conversation would take place. And the brothers would hug, or a brother and sister would hug. then they would say a prayer together, and then the person would go back, sit back down and take communion. Is that viable today? Yes?
Have you ever been cut off by someone while you're coming to worship on Sunday morning?
Andy he said, I hope I don't let things get to that point, but have you ever been cut off, I assume you're in traffic.
Well, yeah.
Somebody cut you off in traffic on your way to worship. Now, Andy, you're meddling.
That word, the Greek word in verse 23 that we use fool, it's actually moros. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but it's said here that that's our root word for moron. How many times have I called someone a moron or chastised them? You know, they didn't know I was chastising them. But see, I think that's the whole point. It's my heart that's not right. So I can't go to that person,
Right.
but I can get my heart.
But you can get, and Andy, for those who are listening, Andy said if he's cut off, he can't go to that person because he doesn't know who they are. But he has to make his heart right. That's a good point. How serious is this? If communion, you go to give your gift at the altar, and we liken this to taking communion. That's the first thing that probably comes to mind. You leave your gift at the altar, you go and make things right, and then you come back and offer your gift. If the world worked on this one principle, how much better would the world be? A lot better. It what? It would. Carl said it would be heaven. Sadie? Sadie said your soul depends on it, and what we've done, we've taken verse 23 and said if you give your gift at the, go and give your, if you're ready to give your gift at the altar, and you remember somebody has something to give, you go and make it right. But we don't put the passages before that where a person is thinking about you're worthless, you're a fool, you're no good. We don't put those passages together and they go together. He's saying to this extreme, you get angry with people to this extreme, and then you try to go and give your gift, it's not acceptable. It's just not. Your heart is not in it. You're doing something strictly because you're commanded to. Your heart has absolutely nothing to do with it.
It's easy when your neighbor calls somebody a moron. It's easy to chuckle at that, or you know, and then it's easy to go down that slippery slope and you start thinking, you know, the homeless or people that have learning disabilities,
Right.
or you know, people that have a skin color difference. It's easy to kind of make, you know,
And Andy said that it's a slippery slope. And that's, we can get to the point where I could not be concerned about you, but just leave me alone. To the point of you really get on my nerves, to the point where you really irritate me, to the point of get out of my way, I don't have anything to do with you, you're worthless. And you made the comment, it's our heart, and we need to guard our heart about this whole situation.
One of the things that I think all of us struggle with, see somebody and we think we're different.
Norman said we see somebody and we think we're better than they are, and that's
Hard to deal with. But as long as our heart is right, come back to the heart.
if we're going to have a heart like Jesus, and that's the key. Zadie?
Really good things can come out of this. So you have that process of getting back with your brother who wanted an involvement. If your brother has, they might even notice somebody else is having a problem but afraid to just go to each other. They've got the knowledge that it can be done, man. I'm not going to tell them.
And that's what we need to be about, is helping one another. I want to share a quick story. Of course, I know all of you have grandkids and you think they're great, but none of them are as great as mine. And I'm just telling, I'm very truthful about that. Mine are the best. I don't care who you are. I was talking to my granddaughter. She got home from Paris last week, and she was on a mission trip all summer. And her little sister, anyway, she had talked to Grandma first, and Grandma told her I got beat by Mel at golf, and it really irritated me. And Grandma said he's really down. He's been beat the last 4 times they've been out. I'm really getting tired of it. But anyway, she said, Papa, I understand what you said. Kate beat me in whatever game they were playing. And she said, I wanted to punch her. And I thought, that. And she said, but I tried to follow the fruit of the Spirit and have a quiet spirit. I just walked away in silence. And I said, well, Mackenzie, I'm proud of you. And so I talked to her in a day or two, and I said, have you punched Kate yet? And she said, no, but I'm thinking about giving her a wet willy. She said, no, I'm trying to maintain the fruit of the Spirit. I'm trying to have a gentle spirit and accept it. And she taught me a lesson. So, Mel, I'm going to be a lot more kind to you the next time we play golf. Maybe. But it's the Spirit of Jesus that we're after. It's the Spirit of Jesus. I've been asked to teach a class on Wednesday night starting in September about how we treat believers. We're going to continue this. If you choose to come to class on Wednesday night, just giving you a heads up, this is what it's going to be about. We're going to get into it more in depth. We will stand in judgment for the way we treat one another. Appreciate your comments this morning.